Okay, so for the record, I'd like to state that my name is Nathan Holdridge, and I will be interviewing Dan Holdridge. I'm on the phone with him. I'm in Denver, Colorado. He's in New York right now, Buffalo, New York, and today's date is November 24th, 2017. Okay, so start out. When and where were you born?
Jamestown, New York.
Okay, and can you say the names of your immediate family?
Uh, Alan Clayton Holdridge,
And that's your father, right?
father.
Yes. Okay. And your mother's name?
My real mother,
Yes.
uh, Rosalie. Uh, well, it was Kozlowski when she got remarried.
Okay. And
Her name
was
was Druso.
okay, perfect. Was there anyone you were particularly close with growing up? A mother, father, brother, etc.
Uh, Actually, I would say my grandmother,
Your grandmother. And what was her name?
Elizabeth Holdridge.
Okay, perfect. Could you describe the relationship you had with her briefly?
Very good relationship because she took care of us most of our growing up time.
Okay.
Uh, after my mom and dad divorced.
Mm-hmm. What
I was only
age?
2 years old.
2 years old.
It's kind of my grandmother and grandmother actually kind of. I mean, my dad was working a lot, but she actually, I would say, took care of us when we were young.
Okay, perfect. So could you real quick just go into what kind of jobs? I mean, you said your mother divorced your father when you were two. So more, what jobs did your dad work as you were
Uh,
growing up?
he was glassman. He worked at Faulkner Plate Glass.
Okay, perfect. So what was it like to grow up where you did? Like, what was different maybe about growing up in Jamestown, New York, as maybe other kids wouldn't have experienced?
I don't know. It was okay growing up in Jamestown. Like I said, my grandmother took care of us a lot.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was always mostly working, but then he tended bar and stuff.
Okay.
So I guess it was all right growing up in Jamestown with my grandmother, and
Mm-hmm.
she took pretty good care of us, me and Johnny.
Yeah. Okay. Were there any sports activities you participated in, especially in like high school, middle school, things like that?
Yes, I played Little League ball
Mm-hmm.
when I was younger, and I played in junior high. I was on the football team,
Okay.
Washington Junior High, and in my last year of high school, I played on the varsity baseball team.
Okay. Cool. So what economic class would you say that your family grew up in?
Uh, let's see, you thought middle class? Is that what you're trying to
Yeah,
say?
like
Like,
upper,
or
middle, lower, kind of just basic. So were you kind of like raised with any specific political views? Like maybe your parents had leaned Republican or Democrat, and how did you take to those views growing up?
I don't think there was much in our family. It was Republican, Democrat. Dad never talked about that much when we were growing up.
Hmm. Would you
Uh,
go ahead? Would
My
you?
views were,
Sorry.
mostly went with Democratic.
Okay. All right. So now just a few questions. More shifting in towards the Vietnam War. So, what were your personal views on the Vietnam War before you had any involvement in the war?
My personal views was I don't think we should have been over there in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I just don't think it was really a war we should have been into.
Yeah. Do you remember any of like the reasons that like our government was telling the people as to why we were over there specifically that you remember?
Not that I remember why they were going over there.
Okay.
To be honest with you.
All right. Now
Just out of high school, I got drafted.
Okay, yeah, that was gonna be my next question.
Oh, okay.
Is were you drafted or did you volunteer?
Yes, I was drafted.
Okay, so I know
Oh,
Johnny went over with you too. Was he drafted as well?
yes.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure because he might have joined. I'm not sure what Johnny did.
Okay.
Because he didn't have to go over to Nam,
Mhm.
but he went anyway.
Okay. So yeah, you got drafted straight out of high school.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
I went to Fort Dix.
Mhm. So did you at the time when you were drafted, did you feel like any pressure to go to Vietnam? Like we talked in our class, there were a lot of people who tried to find ways out of getting drafted, things like that. Were there any like pressures from family members or any pressures that said
No.
you've been drafted, you have to go?
No.
Okay.
No.
And at the time you were deployed, did you know anyone who was already in the war? Friends, family members, anything like that who was already over there?
I knew a lot of friends that were going over there.
Okay. Like out of your high school class, probably?
Yeah, and yeah, a few of the guys that graduated ahead of me.
Okay. So how old were you? You were when you went over to the war?
Let's see. I think I was 18.
18. And how do you think your age and kind of the time period that you grew up in played into your attitude and overall stigma towards the war?
Well, personally, I didn't want to go, but I had to go.
Right.
And I just thought, well, I got drafted. It's kind of my duty. I have to beat up with it. But if I had a choice, I wouldn't have liked to have gone.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you'd probably
get drafted. You have to go.
Right. So you'd probably say that ultimately the reason you ended up going was because you were drafted and you didn't really have any other choice to stay.
Right.
Okay. So what was your role in Vietnam? Maybe talk a little bit about like what branch of the military you served in. What were kind of the things you did while over there?
I was in 855 General Supply Unit.
Okay.
I worked in a supply yard out in Da Nang, and my job was to get stuff off trucks, supply unit, all kinds of supply, and put them away, and then distribute them to the guys coming out of the fields.
Okay.
And we would load their trucks up with supplies and whatnot.
Okay. And do you know like what city in Vietnam you were in while you were doing that?
Da Nang.
Da Nang. Okay. Perfect. So what did you understand to be the United States overall objective in Vietnam while you were over there?
What I thought about the guys that didn't want to go over there, was that what you're saying? Or
More like what you believed the government was trying to accomplish over there. What were they telling you like the mission of being in Vietnam was.
To be honest with you, Nathan, I don't really know what the issue was of us being over there.
Okay. Would you say that was widespread amongst a lot of the men over there, that no one really kind of knew?
Yes, I would say that.
Okay, that's interesting. So what emotions and, what things do you remember feeling most while you were over there?
Well, at first, when I first went over there, I got shipped over into the fields by helicopter, but I wasn't supposed to be in there, so I talked to a captain, and I said, I don't think these are my orders to be here in the fields. So he looked at my orders, and he told me, no, you're not. So he shipped me on the next helicopter over to Da Nang, where the supply units were.
Okay.
And when I first got there, I really didn't want to be there in the jungles. I was seeing all them guys coming out, filthy, dirty, wounded, and to be honest with you, I was scared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's only natural, I'd assume. So you said before you went over, you probably were opposed to the war. Did your opinion of the war change while you were over there? Did you become more against the war by being over there, or how did being over there change your opinions of the war?
I don't think it really changed my opinions. I thought we shouldn't have been over there in the first place, and I still thought that when I was over there. But there's nothing I could do about it, so why even talk about it?
Right.
I just was there, served my time, and luckily I got out of there without any wounds or shot at or anything.
Yeah. So, going back real quick to before you went over to Vietnam, do you remember any anti-war efforts, or were you involved in any anti-war efforts back home stateside?
No, I wasn't.
Okay. Do you remember any in your area?
Yeah, I remember a lot of people protesting and stuff with the Vietnam War.
Okay. Do you know?
I was never involved in any of that.
Okay. Do you know what kind of protests they would do, like marches? What?
Yeah, marches, and think our guys should be over there.
Right. Okay, and then we learned about there was several anti-war pushes from soldiers in Vietnam who were, doing things like throwing grenades into their commanders' tents and all sorts of refusing to fight, things like that. Again, were you involved in any of that, or did you know or witness anyone who did things like that while you were over there?
No, I wasn't involved in it, and I never witnessed anything.
Okay. So how did your deployment come to an end, and how did you feel when it came to an end?
My deployment came to an end. I extended a month early over there, a month extra to get out 5 months early.
Mm-hmm.
So I was really happy when that time came.
Mm-hmm.
And I was, I wasn't wounded or anything. I was happy about that. I was just happy to get out of there.
Yeah. Makes sense.
That's why I extended a month, so I could get out even 5 months earlier out of the service.
So you extended your...
I extended 1 month in Vietnam extra.
Extra, and that got you out 5 months earlier?
Yes, I didn't have to serve when I got back in the United States.
Oh, so you would have had to go back to Vietnam if you hadn't stayed that extra month?
No, I had just 5 more months to serve.
Okay.
But for me extending the extra month, I didn't have to spend 5 more months in the States.
Okay. Okay, I understand.
I did that.
That makes sense. So, When you returned home, how were you received by your friends and family first?
Uh, really great.
Yeah.
They appreciated, us going over there and serving,
Hmm.
and they were glad that I was back and I got back safely.
Yeah. We learned a lot about people, specifically Vietnam veterans, who were treated very poorly when they returned from Vietnam because there was a lot of anti-war movement at the time. Did you personally have any of that happen to you, or do you know anyone who was maybe
Yeah,
received negatively?
they didn't treat us that good when we got back. Uh, I didn't really experience that, but I heard and I saw a few of the issues that they really didn't appreciate us over there and what we've done over there to actually give them freedom.
Hmm. So, would you say that the United States efforts in Vietnam were successful or unsuccessful?
I would say they were unsuccessful because when we finally got out of there, I think we actually lost that war.
Yeah, and a lot of people would agree with you on that.
Yes.
So, how did your time in Vietnam affect you when you came home?
It didn't affect me that bad. Like I said, I was one of the lucky guys. I was in the supply, and I didn't actually see a lot of action.
Hmm.
I had one mortar go over our boots or over our shower when I was in the shower one time, and that was about it. But
Yeah.
otherwise, I kind of ran the daycare center towards my end of my tour there,
Okay.
and the captain in our group, he formed a flag football team that we played in, and we played other, servicemen like Marines and stuff like that.
Okay.
And that kept our minds off of some things.
Yeah. So maybe talk a little bit about that. Some of the things that you did while you were over there, like the Flag Football League, that kind of the guys did to keep their minds off the war.
Mm-hmm. Well, the captain that made like a flag football team to travel at certain times, and so not everybody, was in on it. We just had enough guys to complete a team, and we played with other units there.
Mm-hmm.
And me and my buddy that I met over there, we went to PXs a lot, and we played ping pong. Kind of we had matches against each other and stuff like that, and that was exciting.
Yeah.
And we went to R&R, like I went to Bangkok for a week, and that wasn't that great over there.
Yeah.
But it was getting away from Da Nang for a week.
Right.
And that's about it. Then we guarded the beach at night.
Mm-hmm.
So our unit took turns on the beach, watching the beach. And that was about mostly it.
Yeah. Okay. Another thing we talked about is there was a lot of confusion amongst the troops on who we were fighting with the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong and things like that. And then I know you said you mostly worked on the supply yard, so you didn't see a whole lot of combat actually. But could you just maybe speak to maybe someone you knew or people who were going off there? Was there a lot of confusion between who are we fighting? Everyone's a threat, things like that.
especially the guys that were in the field, I would think.
Yeah. So what would you say the stigma around the war was by the time of your return? Like, was the nation turning towards we need to leave Vietnam? Were we still heavily involved and we should be in Vietnam? Or what would you say the attitude of the nation was to the war after you got back?
Well, the troops that I were with and probably the other friends that I knew that were in combat, I think most of them thought they shouldn't be over there. But in their opinion, they had a duty to do. They had a duty to do. And we just did it and hope we got out of there safely.
That's good. So if
I'm answering these questions good enough for you.
Oh yeah, this is great. So if you were presented with the same, I mean, obviously it wasn't much of a choice for you to go over, but if you were presented with the same situation, would you go over and do it again?
Yeah, if it meant for freedom for our country, I think I would.
Okay. Can you think of one example of a negative effect that the war had on either you or someone you served with once you returned?
Well, I would say that it probably a lot of guys over there probably come back with terror, thinking of what they went through, especially the guys in the fields. I mean, it probably took a lot of they probably were so scared and mad, wondered if they were going to get out of there. And they see other friends of theirs die in the same combat zone or something.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard for me to say because I wasn't in that situation.
Right.
But I heard friends of mine that were talking about it.
Yeah.
And it was scary, they said. I guess that's all I really know about it.
Yeah.
If I was in the field, I might express my opinion a little more differently.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember a lot of you guys being like frustrated because like a lot of the troops, you included, it sounds like, were like, why are we over here? Kind of frustrated that you're over here when you feel like you shouldn't be over here. Was there a lot of that amongst your troops?
Yes, I would say so.
Okay. And then just go ahead.
I think they were frustrated that a lot of them thought we shouldn't be there, but we had to be there, so that's all it was.
Would you say the majority of people who were over there thought we shouldn't be over there?
I would think so.
Just to finish up, can you give one example of a positive effect that the war had on you or someone you served with?
I would say I was proud to be over there for our freedom and to help our country get through this, even though I didn't think we should be there, but I was just proud to be a serviceman serving for our country at that time.
Okay. And then, how did your service in Vietnam affect your political views, and more specifically, like the way you view when our nation decides to send troops somewhere like the war in Afghanistan and Iraq? How did that affect your views on political issues like that?
Well, I think in those situations, Iraq and that, uh, I don't know the situation. Didn't really know a lot of the situation there, but I suppose we should be over there to for our country. I don't know if I would have liked to have gone over there. I didn't really like to go to Vietnam in the first place, but
Mm-hmm.
uh, a lot of them probably wish they weren't over there either. I mean, they might, but then there's probably guys there that wish they were there for their country, to serve their country, and give all the people that didn't have to go their freedom.
Okay. Perfect. Well, that's all I really have for you. I just wanted to personally thank you for what you did over there and
Thank you.
in allowing us to be here and be free. And also thank you for your time and letting me interview you today. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Nathan. I hope I helped you.
Yeah, you did.
I didn't say the right things, but I'm not sure.
You did. It was great. Thank you.